In this video, we're going to look at decision-making, reproducibility, and transparency. By the end of this video, you should understand what a workflow is and why it's important, what the core principles of data science are, what reproducibility is as a concept and why it's important in data science, likewise what transparency is and why it's important in data science, and finally how you can implement these principles in practice. A central tenet that we'll come back to many times in this class is that data science is built around a workflow. In fact, implementing the principles of data science in practice requires that you have a workflow. But what is a workflow? In data science, it's a set of procedures that take you from steps before you even start collecting data all the way through using that data to make informed decisions. Every organization is going to have their own workflow. This class is going to focus on a very general version of the workflow, and I'm going to discuss that in much more detail in the next video. But just as a bit of a preview, this is the type of workflow that I'd like you to think about in terms of data science. As you can see, it's a flowchart of steps that starts all the way at the beginning where you acquire data, and even before that when you're specifying the types of data that you'd like to acquire, and takes you all the way to the point where you're actually utilizing that data to make decisions and then evaluate how well those decisions worked. The other important part of this workflow is it's a circle. It never stops. Even after you make decisions, in the end, you're going to go back and reevaluate those decisions through a formalized process. So why do we use this workflow? The data science workflow is designed with the core principles of data science in mind. And these are reproducibility, which means that every step of the workflow can be reproduced precisely by anyone who has access to the data, and transparency. And what I mean by transparency is that what happens in, or the justification for every step of the process, is clear to anyone who looks at it. So how are we going to achieve these goals in practice? The first step is that we're going to perform every step using standardized data analysis software. In this class, we're going to use R and RStudio. But other organizations may use different software depending on their needs. The important thing is that the computer code clearly shows and records each step of the data analysis process. And when you use standardized software, the same inputs, I'm talking about data and the programs that process them, are generally going to produce the same results no matter who runs it. Also, we're going to include documentation with our computer code. The documentation describes each step and provides information that isn't contained in or maybe isn't obvious in the computer code that will help people understand and be able to replicate these analyses down the road. So again, the core principles of data science that we're trying to promote here are reproducibility and transparency, and it's important that we understand what each of these are if we're going to implement them in practice. So what is reproducibility, and what makes something reproducible? A workflow is going to be reproducible if, given identical inputs, anyone following the exact same workflow will get precisely the same results. I'm not talking about getting approximately the same results or something that looks similar, but precisely the same results. So why is reproducibility important? There are many reasons. In scientific research, there's been a narrative in the media recently that some scientific research isn't reproducible. In fact, one study back in 2015 showed that over 50% of studies in psychology couldn't be replicated. Now, some of this was experimental design, but some of it also was that people who had the exact same data couldn't find the same results as the original authors. And this is a problem. Importantly, scientific results need to be reproducible for people to have confidence in their conclusions. But also, science is an iterative process. As human knowledge progresses, we build off the work of previous scientists, and frequently the initial step when doing research is just to replicate work that someone else has done in the past. This is all much easier if details of their workflow are available and can be easily replicated. But outside of the scientific context, reproducibility is still very important, particularly in business workflows. So businesses are going to use data analysis to inform their decisions, and reproducibility is critical in these situations. Why is that? Because you're using this data analysis to make business decisions, and businesses need to have confidence in where their decisions are coming from, but also when they go to evaluate these decisions after the fact, they need to know what components of the analysis led to those decisions, and you can only do that if you can reproduce the original analysis. On top of that, analysis teams in businesses are dynamic. Analysts leave, they're reassigned, or they're promoted. And the only way that you can continue to produce reliable results that businesses have confidence in is if even as teams change, as people change, their workflow can still be replicated. So how are we going to achieve these goals? Importantly, each step of the workflow should be implemented with the goal that another person can pick up the project and implement the exact same processes. You can do this by performing all of your analysis in standardized computing software where everything is contained in computer programs that someone can simply open up, run, and using the same data, they should be able to produce the exact same results. But also it's important that you document the sources of your data, the software you use, the steps that you used in your analyses, and any exceptions that you made to your standard processes so people know all of the changes that you might have made to a workflow or all of the steps in your workflow when they're replicating your work. So in this class, I'll often talk about how we're using data analysis to make better decisions. How does a reproducible workflow help us make better decisions? The most important thing is that decisions generally aren't made just once. And if you got a decision right, you want to be able to make that decision again in the future in a way that you think is correct or optimal. But if you didn't get a decision right, then you want to be able to revisit the process, figure out where you might have gone wrong, go back and make changes. And a reproducible workflow allows anyone who has access to the computer code and the data to go back and examine every step, look for ways to improve, and make modifications. The second core principle of data science is transparency. So what do I mean by a transparent workflow? A transparent workflow means that anyone examining your workflow can look at every step and see and understand the decisions and assumptions that you've made along the way. They understand what each step of your workflow does, and they understand how decisions might affect future steps in the workflow. So this may seem a lot like reproducibility. The important thing with transparency is it's focused on the why of your data analysis, where reproducibility is much more focused on the what or the how. So why is transparency important? I think this comes best by way of an example. If you've seen the original 1990s Jurassic Park, you might remember Dennis Nedry. He ran all of the computer systems at Jurassic Park and made very complicated systems to handle all the dinosaurs and keep them safe inside the park. Unfortunately, Dennis was the only person who understood how all these systems worked. His workflow was not transparent. And as a result, when Dennis became unavailable and the systems in Jurassic Park failed, the dinosaurs got loose and chaos ensued. So in contexts that don't involve genetically engineered dinosaurs, why is transparency important? In research, people need to understand why you have made certain decisions to have faith in your results. Examples that come to mind are possibly your choice of modeling decisions, or decisions that you might have made about weird data that you have. Transparency is critical, though, in a business context. Again, in business context, you're generally using data analyses to try and make better decisions as a business. And when a workflow is transparent, you can go back and see what components of that process worked and which didn't. And that can help you adapt to when conditions start to change for a business. So what steps can we take to make transparent workflows? Most importantly, you need to clearly document every step of your work. This can involve comments in your scripts or programs, providing other documentation when needed, when you can't put those things in comments in your programs. But importantly, just talking to people that you are working with. And not just about the how of your doing things, but the why. But how do we implement these things in practice? Importantly, you should use standardized software. It may seem a little abstract to you now, but it won't by the end of the class. Everyone who uses R for data science knows what the LM function does. There's no ambiguity there. When you use the LM function, it's very clear to everyone exactly what is happening. At the same time, you should follow the best practices of your team. You might know a clever way to do something faster in another programming language, but it's not transparent if no one else understands what you did. So again, reproducibility and transparency are the core tenets of data science. I'm going to come back to these throughout the course, and I expect your workflows to show reproducibility and transparency. And again, these concepts may seem very similar, but they're distinct. And a workflow or a business process may exhibit one, none, or both of these attributes. But remember, a workflow is reproducible if anyone with access to the data and the workflow details will get precisely the same result or reach the same conclusions. And a workflow is transparent if the how and why of every step of your workflow is clear to anyone who's examining it.